Good day. Today is the second day of the Kherson counterattack or counteroffensive, whichever you prefer. I've noticed that some sources are now referring to it as a counterattack, and we're getting a rather clearer picture of exactly what happened over the previous 24 hours. But before we do, perhaps we should discuss why this attack happened at all. Because, of course, for months and weeks, we've been hearing about a Kherson counteroffensive being prepared for the second half of August. The second half of August came, and there was no sign of a counteroffensive. And we were getting more and more reports, not just from Western journalists on the scene, but also from Ukrainian officials, which were saying that Ukraine wasn't in a position to launch a counteroffensive in Kherson. And it looked as if this entire idea of a counteroffensive had been called off. And yet suddenly, almost out of nowhere, just a few hours after I was reading in the Daily Telegraph, which is perhaps the single most gung-ho pro-Ukrainian newspaper in Britain, and that is saying quite a lot. Just a few hours after the Daily Telegraph was itself publishing articles saying that the idea of a Kherson counteroffensive had been called off because Ukraine didn't have enough artillery to support such an offensive. Suddenly we got the news that a series of attacks had been launched by Ukraine in the Kherson region. And over the next few hours, Ukrainian officials started talking as if this was indeed the Kherson counteroffensive. Media outlets in the West then began to pick up that story, as of course did media outlets in Russia. And there is no doubt at all that a very significant attack did take place. And it seems to have taken place in three places. Now, two of them were on the western flank, if you like, of the Russian forces, the areas which seem to be positioned towards Nikolaev, where the Russians over the last couple of days, weeks, have been making significant advances. Now, the narrative that's accepted on all sides, Russian, Ukrainian, Western, is that these attacks in these directions, these western directions, were in fact diversionary attacks by relatively small groups of Ukrainian troops, supposedly intended to draw the weight of the Russian artillery away from the main offensive, which was going to come in the north. And that may very well be true, but I would say that what is being suggested here is that these small assault groups were basically being thrown into battle in some kind of kamikaze role. In other words, they're being sent to fight in the knowledge that they would be heavily shelled and would suffer severe losses as part of some sort of diversionary exercise for the main Ukrainian thrust, which was to come in the north. Now, of course, diversionary attacks do take place sometimes. War being a very ruthless thing, they're necessary. But I do ask myself whether they were really strictly necessary in this case, and whether, if they were diversionary attacks, whether the soldiers who participated in them were aware of the fact. Anyway, what one can say with confidence is that these two attacks were easily repelled by the Russians. The Ukrainians were indeed defeated in these two directions, and they were hurled back with very heavy losses. So these two attacks, if they were diversionary attacks, have been a failure. The other attack, what we're told is the main attack, came in the north, and it came in an area near the Ingulets River, where there's two large villages, Ardika and Lazovye. I'm probably getting their names wrong, for which I apologize. But it's important to say that these villages have been contested between the Russians and the Ukrainians for a considerable amount of time. Now, What is indisputable is that the Ukrainians did launch a very large force in this area, and for a time it does seem to have captured a certain amount of ground. Not very much. We're talking about a few kilometers. There was a capture. These two places, Avdiivka and Lozovye, if I'm getting their names wrong, my apologies, were indeed brought under Ukrainian control. There's some suggestions that they've always been under Ukrainian control. Avdiivka, I suspect, probably always was. Lozovye, apparently it's been contested. Anyway, Lozovye was brought under Ukrainian control, and the Ukrainians were able to expand their forces and were able to capture a small hamlet a little further. But then the Russian artillery, aircraft, helicopter, gunships, missile forces were brought to bear. And so far as I can see, and of course there's going to be a great deal of argument and discussion about what exactly is happening, and it'll be some time before we have complete clarity, but so far as we can see, as I can see, the Ukrainian attack then petered out, or at least the advance stopped, and the Ukrainians seem to have evacuated their positions from this particular hamlet. There were reports earlier during the night that a Russian force had been supposedly operationally encircled in another place called Visopolye. I'm not, again, sure that I'm getting the names of this right. I should say that with reading, for me, not always being easy, I'm not always able initially to get a precise handle on names. I do eventually, I think, get there. But regardless of that, it does seem that for a time at least a Russian force was operationally encircled, but it seems to have held its ground. Moreover, from what I've been able to understand, the Ukrainian breakthrough where it did take place was against a part of the front line which was held by the Donetsk militia, reservists, I should say, from the Donetsk militia, second-line troops, whereas other parts of the front line are held by forces of the Russian regular army. Unsurprisingly, under heavy Ukrainian artillery attack, the reservists retreated, but the regular Russian forces appear to have held their ground, and as of the time of making of this video, they have still done so. So the net result of what has happened, so far as I can judge, is that the Ukrainians have been able to increase the territory that they control by a few kilometers, but they've also suffered extremely heavy losses. Now, the Russians have provided some extraordinary figures for the numbers of Ukrainian soldiers and equipment which they say has been destroyed over the course of this fighting. Now, I have to say that these are Russian figures to the extent that we can believe them. It's difficult to know how accurate they are. And I have to say that I do always sometimes wonder how exactly the Russians are able to collect these very precise numbers of figures that they give for the nature of the fighting that's taking place in any particular place, and for the losses that they say that the Ukrainians are suffering. But there we are. These are the Russian figures for what they're worth. The Russians say that something like 100 Ukrainian armored vehicles were destroyed and 1,200 Ukrainian troops were destroyed as well. That's an increase from the 560 Ukrainian troops they say were killed, which came earlier over the course of the fighting. That number has now been increased to 1,200. Now, I want to stress that I'm not quite clear whether the 1,200 figure is supposed to refer to soldiers actually, Ukrainian soldiers actually allegedly killed. But the Russians did use the term, as far as I can see, at least in their English language bulletins, destroyed, which does suggest killed. Now, if that's true, then this is an appallingly high rate of loss. Now, I was watching a program by the Military Summary Channel discussing in the very interesting and informative way that the Military Summary Channel often covers fighting in Ukraine. I was watching a program that the Military Summary Channel did about the fighting in Kherson region, and I noticed that Dima, the person who provides us with this information on the Military Summary Channel, was downplaying the significance of Ukraine losing 560 men. He said that this would be only 2% of the total Ukrainian forces committed to the fighting, which he guesstimates at 36,000. I don't know where he got that figure from, by the way. I understand that the Ukrainians themselves say that the number is closer to 15,000, which I have to say seems much more plausible to me. But anyway, that's Dima's calculation. And he argues that this 560 out of 36,000 is a small number, 2% of the total, and that the Ukrainian offensive anyway has been taking place across the entire front line in Kherson region. Now, I'm not sure that this is correct. Firstly, as I said, I'm not sure where this 36,000 figure has come from. I'm sure that Dima has his calculations for this. But of course, if it's 1,200, then it's more than 2%. It's more like 4%. And anyway, 560 dead is presumably accompanied by a large number of people who've been wounded. And anyway, one way or the other, the figures stack up. To me, it looks like an extremely high rate of loss for a single day at the start of a counteroffensive like this. And the interesting thing is that last night, the Ukrainian General Staff did not publish any information whatsoever about the progress of the counteroffensive. Now, there may be many explanations for this, but there are rumors, and I stress these are only rumors, that the issue of this counteroffensive became an issue of contention between President Zelensky and General Zaluzhny, the head of the Ukrainian General Staff. And it seems that General Zaluzhny advised against this counteroffensive. A couple of days ago, there were reports that he was suggesting instead a counteroffensive in the ETHEREUM area of Kharkiv, not in Kherson region, and that it was he who was saying that Ukraine doesn't have the artillery, doesn't have the tanks, doesn't have the manpower to carry out a successful offensive to recapture Kherson region. But apparently and supposedly and allegedly, he was overruled by President Zelensky, who basically gave General Zaluzhny an ultimatum. Either he carried out this counteroffensive or he was sacked. And in the face of this straightforward decision, demand, General Zaluzhny did presumably organize this counteroffensive, though the fact that the Ukrainian General Staff did not at last night say anything about it may be a sign that these rumors are true, and may be a sign that the Ukrainian General Staff is unhappy about having been pushed into this counteroffensive with all the very, very heavy losses that have been incurred. Anyway, the long and the short of it is this. It looks as if the Russian front lines are actually holding. It looks as if the Ukrainian forces have only been able to make minor progress in one area, retaking one village, which they have previously held over the previous weeks, in an area where there's often a swing backwards and forwards between them and the Russians, and that they've suffered very heavy losses in the process. And it also looks as if this offensive, this is of course just a very preliminary view, it may be wrong, it looks as if this offensive may be running out of steam. Now, there were reports that hospitals in Nikolaev and Kryvyi Rog, the two Ukrainian-held cities closest to the front lines, are now filled with wounded from these battlefields. And by the way, when we talk about dead, we should always consider wounded, and if we're talking about total casualties and the reduction of the military force, then we should always include the wounded along with the dead. This is a callous thing to say, but it was talking about military units. Then obviously people who are so wounded as to have to be sent to hospital, well, that means that they're no longer serving in the military unit that they belong to, and that is a reduction in the military power of that unit, analogous to what would be the case if the soldier who was wounded and had been taken out of the battle were actually dead. Anyway, putting all that aside, it seems that hospitals in Kryvyi Rog and Nikolaev are now crammed with wounded soldiers, that the authorities, the Ukrainian authorities in Nikolaev, are soliciting people for blood donations. And perhaps the clearest sign that these guesstimates that 36,000 troops are involved in this operation may be exaggerated. We also hear that the Ukrainians are pulling forward reserves from Odessa, reserves presumably intended to defend Odessa, that they're being thrown in to plug the gaps in the front lines. Now, if that is all true, then as I said, it would reinforce the view that this offensive is running out of steam, that it's failing to break through. And another factor which may point to that same conclusion is that Arestovich, President Zelensky's advisor and spin doctor, some people call him a propagandist, some people also call him a fantasist, I will call him a spin doctor, is apparently now going out and giving warnings, giving interviews and writing pieces on Telegram in which he says that this is going to be a slow grind, that this isn't going to be a rapid advance, that which in effect looks like some kind of an admission that only very limited progress has been made. Well, if we go to the Russian offensive in Donbass, we see that that too is slow and incremental, but we've seen that the Russians conduct that offensive in a way that ensures that the losses from that incremental offensive in Donbass are borne disproportionately by the Ukrainians. In this offensive, the offensive that Ukraine appears to have launched in Kherson region, it seems on the contrary that it is the Ukrainians, the attacking force in other words, that has disproportionately borne the losses. So if we're talking about a grinding offensive here, it's more like the kind of grinding offensive that British people will be familiar with from the First World War, offensives like the one at the Somme and Passchendaele during the First World War, which captured little ground, but in the face of enormous losses. So that seems to me to be an indication that this offensive has not perhaps achieved the kind of breakthrough that the Ukrainians were hoping for. Why did they launch it? As I said, we've had all these reports for all these days, all these weeks, that the offensive, the Kherson offensive, had been called off. Well, I don't know the answer to that, and it may be that all that information about the offensive having been called off was disinformation. It might have been intended to fool the Russians. It might have been intended to fool everybody. It might have been intended to create a bigger impression when the offensive took place. But there is a theory, and it's not just a theory, there is a fairly well-developed rumour. It is a rumour, but it's plausible, that what actually happened, that the reason that this offensive was launched was because Prime Minister Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, when he went to Kiev a short while ago and met Zelensky there, told Zelensky that it was essential that this counteroffensive in Kherson region be launched after all. The British have been pushing this counteroffensive relentlessly on the Ukrainians for months. The media in Britain has been heavily prepared to expect this counteroffensive. I've spoken in previous programs about the sense of betrayal amongst the British media here in London that the counteroffensive hadn't happened. There's growing signs. There's been an opinion poll in the Sunday Times which shows diminishing support for the war in Britain, as people in Britain feel the pressure of the economic crisis. And one can understand also perhaps why Boris Johnson, who in my opinion has a Churchill complex, might have wanted a counteroffensive anyway in Kherson, a successful counteroffensive that he could show as another success of his premiership, which is of course literally just a few weeks now from ending. So one can understand why the British might have been pushing for a counteroffensive at this time, even though, as I said, the Ukrainian military themselves supposedly were reluctant to do this. Now, there is one fact which makes me think more than any other that this claim, which is being widely reported, that it was the British who pushed for this counteroffensive at this time, there is one fact which makes me think that this might be true, and that is that the Ministry of Defence, the British Ministry of Defence, published one of its regular summaries a few days ago, a day or so ago, in which they talked about the intensification of the Russian offensive in Donbass, and they said that this was probably taking place in order to distract the Ukrainians from the advance, from the offensive in Kherson, the big offensive, not necessarily in Kherson, but the big counteroffensive, that there were speculations that the Ukrainians were about to launch. So that rather suggests that the British had some inside knowledge that some kind of counteroffensive was indeed being prepared by the Ukrainians, and logically that was, of course, the counteroffensive that we're just seeing in Kherson region. And it could be that this bulletin, this summary by the British Ministry of Defence, was just a little bit more pressure on the Ukrainians to make sure that this counteroffensive was indeed launched. Who knows? I find this rumour about Boris Johnson and the British pushing for this counteroffensive, I have to say, entirely plausible. I would say that the British media, in the hours after the counteroffensive was launched, were full of coverage of it. As reports began to trickle through that it wasn't going particularly well, I noticed that the coverage basically started to get relegated, and I'm not saying it's entirely vanished from the front pages, but it's certainly not been given the emphasis that it originally was. So there we go. That seems to be the story of the Ukrainian counteroffensive up to now. Limited progress achieved at disproportionately heavy losses. Unlikely, it seems to me, to be sustained. And of course, there's growing reports, growing suggestions from various people on the Russian side that this may be opening the way for a Russian advance in other places. Well, we shall see. We shall see how this all turns out. I will obviously keep track of events and try to keep on top of what's happening. But for the moment, the situation, as I said, does not look like the Ukrainians have achieved any sort of breakthrough, but no doubt we'll be getting more information over the next few days and hours. Meanwhile, the Russian offensive in Donbass continues. There's more news that apparently Kodema, this important town south of Bakhmut, has indeed now been captured, but I'm not going to cover that today. What I will say is this: there's been a very interesting article by Eve Smith on naked capitalism, pointing once again to the catastrophic position of the European economy as a result of the sanctions war. And that leads me to think that her assumptions about this, her analysis of this is correct, and she says that it's only now that European politicians have returned from their holidays that they fully understand the full gravity of the crisis that they are facing. And she also speculates that before very long this crisis will start to affect the functioning of Europe's brittle financial system. I think she may be right, in fact I'm sure she is, in which case we are in for some very, very difficult times in Europe indeed. And it may be that it is the knowledge of this that has been another factor in pushing Ukraine to conduct this counteroffensive in Kherson region at this particular time. The knowledge that there is a deepening crisis in Europe, and that perhaps Europe's ability to continue supporting Ukraine may soon be exhausted. Well, we shall see. That is the summary of the situation up to now. I'm sure there'll be more news over the next couple of hours. I will catch up with it. I'll let you know what I think. And in the meantime, it only remains for me to remind you that you can catch all our videos, mine, Alex Christophorou's, the Durans, on our various platforms, not just YouTube, but also Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE and Telegram, and also that you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and that you can you should also check out our shop and buy the great things that you will find there, our t-shirts, sweatshirts, hats, hoodies, all those things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. And thank you for joining me again today, and more from me soon.